Alright, welcome to part 4 of my complete Hellhorned guide for Monster Train, the Divinity DLC, covering 25 champions. I don't really know what more to say. There's chapter markers as always. I'm sure some people are maybe only interested in certain champs over the others. And, these are just my opinions. This is how I play. This is all according to how I've structured the guide, so there's going to be heavy, just Gabriot influence on this one, shall we say. If I say something is bad, know that I'm essentially saying, I think it's bad. It's not necessarily bad. There's probably players out there that can still win a lot with certain paths that I don't particularly like, but let's get into it here. So we're going over Hornbreaker Prince first. It's the first champ you play when you boot up the game. And, we got a little bit of memeing going on here, but essentially this is kind of how I feel about the paths in a general sense. Brawler is much more the preferred path, I'd say, in the DLC world. Full Brawler, to be specific. Reaper, I just do not like it. And, like I mentioned in the intro, it's just my opinion. It's just like my opinion, man. And maybe there's some people that can do good with it, but since this is based on my own experiences, I can only really provide a guidance, if you will, on what I have experienced. And in my experience, Reaper just is useless in the DLC. One of the worst paths of any champs, I would say. And Wrathful, I'm kind of shrugging here. I'm like, it's okay, rank 1, but beyond that, it falls off, but maybe that's fine. There's kind of an argument to be made that often in the DLC world, the champ just isn't your carry. And if that's the case, maybe Wrathful's okay, because it gets you through Ring 1 and 2, which is often what a lot of champs, that's really all they're doing these days. And in that sense, maybe Wrathful's fine, but I do definitely think that whereas Wrathful was pretty good pre-DLC, I actually preferred it. Generally, just with this one Brawler, 2 Wrathful was usually my preferred path in almost every case. Now that path, I think, is significantly weaker, to the point where if I go that path, I rarely use the champ come End-Game and even Mid-Game. But we're going to get through each of these. I'm not really going to get into Reaper. As I said, I don't really use it, so I don't have much to say about it. But let's take a look at the Brawler Path. So, the good is it has a very strong endgame. You'll notice it has some of these champs, when you go all 3 into the path, they get kind of this extra power spike in the 3rd rank, and Brawler is definitely one of those. It gets just the 1 extra strike with each of the first 2 ranks, but then it gets 2 extra strikes on the 3rd rank. And, kind of my thoughts there are that it often has a weak early and mid-game as a result. So I still think this champ is a pretty weak champ in a general sense, even though this is, in my opinion, the best path. And my argument here for why it's still even weak with 3 into Brawler is the 1st and 2nd ranks, rank 1 without any... It's often tough for me to justify starting Brawler if I don't have any damage buffs, because it's going to be a very, very rough early game. It can be good, obviously, as I said, early game, if you have like a Ritual Battle or Fledgling Imps, or even like a Razor Sharp Edge. But very poor early game if you don't have any of those. It's, at that point, just a 16 health, 12 damage dude. It multi-strikes, but that's mostly irrelevant. If anything, it's a bad thing. If spikes, it just means you really can't go spikes. Or any trial, really. I mean, if you have no damage upgrades and you don't have some heavy-hitting spell, like a Crit Builder or Ice Tornado or something, you just, shouldn't take any shards or trial, because you're going to have a very bad early game. And then, on that same note, even with starting with rituals, let's say, it's probably the best case for Brawler. Even rank 1 and 2 are nothing that special. I mean, compare rank 2 to an Animus of Will, for example. An Animus of Will is just better. At an unupgraded Animus of Will is comparable. You know, they have about the same stats. This technically has more health, but damage-wise it's about the same. But most likely you're getting some sort of upgrades on the Animus of Will, like even something like just a Battle Stone or 25 health upgrade. Ideally, like a large stone is going to make Animus of Will just, you know, easily better. It already has an extra strike, right? Or sorry, it has the same amount of strikes as Brawler 2. It has an extra strike compared to Brawler 1. And you can buy an extra strike for Animus of Will, whereas you can't do that for the Hornbreaker Prince. You can buy extra health. You can buy extra starting damage. You can buy a quick. Yeah, you could do an endless, but really the main thing are just stats and extra strike or quick that you'd be super interested in. And in that sense, uninfused, by the way, that's just talking Merchant of Steel upgrades. It's already better than Brawler. And let's factor in that you can have great infusions, right? You can have infusions that up the stats by a lot, add extra strikes, add quickness, add weird scaling things, and none of this can be said of the champ, right? So, and that's just Animus of Will as an example. Even like, I would say, One-Horned Warrior, or Hellhorned Warrior, I don't know, I can't remember the name, Axe Dude that has an initial multi-strike, I'd argue is generally better still than the first two ranks of Brawler. You know, you can add that extra multi-strike, you can add stats, you can add infusions. These are all generally going to make it better than the champ. But rank 3 is where you finally have the champ finally having the potential to outshine kind of your bread and butter backliners, right? Because you're obviously using Brawler as a backliner. You're not going to frontline with it unless you have some weird deck. But in a lot of cases, a sweeper, a multi-striker, or just some other banner unit backliner with some utility is going to be better than the first two ranks of Hornbreaker Prince. It's only the third rank, which comes in only the final 2 to 3 rings, depending on if you're going for Divinity or not. I'm assuming we're going for Divinity, so final 3 rings. But, you know, up until then, it's often just a throwaway unit, because let's say if you did find one of those banners, you might as well use them over Hornbreaker, if you already have a good tank as well. Probably priority is getting a tank, because you can still make Brawler work ranks 1 and 2 as a backliner. It's perfectly fine at that. It's just not necessarily stellar at it. But I guess what I'm trying to say is if it's not something like Fledgling Imp that just sort of does the whole floor indiscriminately, if it's something like Ritual of Battle, if it's something like Razor Sharp Edge that is your scaling, it's just a single target, well, if you have a better banner unit, you're just going to use that over Brawler. Okay, let me mute really quick my desktop sound. I don't want Discord like pinging everything. All right, we're back. So, anyway, but that's, you know, essentially what you want with Brawler. You want to hunt for rage or flat damage increases. Otherwise, you're not utilizing it. Like, who cares if it strikes 5 times if you don't have a way to buff it? That's an awful champ at that point. So if you're going to go Brawler, if you're going to use Brawler, heavily prioritize Rage cards. Rage is going to be your best bet to make use of this unit. If not Rage, settle for some flat damage increase or some other way of getting damage. Yeah, definitely don't take Spikes. As I said, Spike's Trials will wreck him unless you got something like a Branding Right or Wilder Helper or something like that. And also the low it's worth noting, it never gets a higher HP pool. It always just gets armor as it levels up, and not that much armor, by the way. Measly 5 each rank. It means things like Razor Sharp Edge, even like Dark Deal, have their limits, shall we say. And even Branding Right. All of these things have issues with Brawler, so it's worth noting. And I thought it was worth, since, as I said, often champs, even sometimes when I go Brawler 3, I just throw the unit away by mid to end game, but it's worth noting what to do with these champs in the first
couple rings, because that's usually you're almost always using the champ to win those rings. So it's worth noting what the game plan is there. So as I noted, hopefully you started with some damage scaling if you're going Brawler. I would generally say if you don't have damage scaling, go Wrathful if it's offered. The worst case scenario is you start with no damage scaling, and then Brawler and Reaper are your only choices. And I honestly don't know what you do in that situation. Both units are basically going to get wrecked by the boss, by the waves. Maybe you could argue a Reaper is better in that case, but I'd still probably just take Brawler and don't take any shards, don't take any trials. And as I say here, even if I have damage scaling, but especially if I don't, I would prioritize these early game oriented artifacts. And some of these are kind of good throughout the whole game, but I listed ones that are really going to, in my opinion, give you some early game boost that can help survive these early rings. Because Hornbreaker, I will say, even the Wrathful route, I didn't list all these out in my, spoiler alert, when it comes to the Wrathful readout here, I didn't list them all out, but you can refer back to here for Wrathful as well. Even though Wrathful is, in my opinion, typically the better early game of Hornbreaker Prince paths, it's still weak. I think Hornbreaker Prince is one of the weakest early game champs in the game. Almost all the paths have troubles with almost every trial and leak a ton of damage, and most of the time can't kill the boss. So things like this advanced prototype here is one of the best you can get. I'd almost snap pick it unless there's other options that you're seeing here. But that alone will allow you to get through the first 3 rings basically with stewards alone. It doesn't even matter. You can hit a Merchant of Steel, get some basic upgrades on a few stewards, and you'll even get through ring 3 or 4 with just the stewards. So that's a high one. Conscription Notice is a great one too. This one provides value the entire run, where, prototype, it's rare that you're using those stewards by the end, so you're really getting a strong early game that eventually becomes kind of a throwaway by end game, which is obviously fine in this case. But something like Conscription Notice, a nice thing there. Faulty Loader as well is like both of these kind of provide value throughout the whole run while also having a very strong early game. Conscription Notice just gives you a very decent statted, pip reduced, free unit, and that will wreck ring 1 almost. The worst case scenario is it gives you Lady of the House, because then it's just going to burn out. But even in that case, I would say you can just not play Lady of the House and try to cycle back into it for the boss. And then Faulty Loader, just a pretty underrated artifact, I would say. I didn't really pay it enough respect, and I've come to really love this artifact. But especially in if you think about the first 2 rings, there's only 2 waves in each of them. And literally 50% of them can't attack and have melee weakness if you have this artifact. So definitely strong early game. Jack Strips, I skipped this more than I should because I don't really like it. I think it completely falls off by late game. I don't really think there's enough damage shield late game to warrant it having any value, but I will admit early game pretty good, especially if you're not going heavy on shards, and if you don't run into armor trials. It's obviously going to wreck clergymen in particular, and Mark of Invasions. But it has mid-game help too. Like, again, if you don't shard up too heavily, which I'd probably recommend with Hellhorned Prince, sycophants, everything. But, it just kind of has jack strips and rules of containment. So this frostbite one here, same boat with both of them. They pretty much completely fall off by late game, but they will wreck the early game. And even I listed these 2 out here. They basically just pyre health type artifacts. They obviously don't help you clear the waves or the bosses or anything, but they just give you that extra buffer room to deal with the leaks. Leaks both in the sense of waves and unfinished bosses, right? You damage the boss as much as you can often with Hornbreaker Prince, but you usually just don't kill it. And you're going to have it hit your pyre a few times. If you have that extra buffer room, it'll be great. In a similar sense, that's also why Vapor Funnel's good. The +3 magic artifact, that's going to be good with the torches. that'll allow you to do 5 damage with them, which is going to kill everything outside of every backliner, even the sharded up ones, outside of an armor trial. So you probably still don't want to take an armor trial with this, if it's something where those backliners are a bit scary. But otherwise, this talisman will be pretty good for you. And then these, like, an initial 5 damage, initial rage, that'll help. Particularly, I mean, it's going to make, Hornbreaker have pretty nice little damage buff. But also, your stewards, and particularly with some combos, like, it'll make dregs a lot better. It'll make morsels a lot better. Like, these are pretty great with morsels and dregs. Any sort of thing where you're kind of pushing out little tokens, even if you start with some imps, like some molting imps or something, it makes them have additional value, right? So these, they often don't do much by late game, but early game they're providing a lot of extra damage. This, I believe it's called Emblem of the Exile, basically gives you 5 HP to the frontliner every turn. Not going to help you with the waves, but it'll help you with the boss for sure. It provides some defensive scaling, which this unit is in dire need of, and it's also one of those that provides value throughout the entire run. So you can have a steward on the middle floor and then maybe Prince at the top, and every turn they'll be gathering health, which will give you maybe an extra 3 to 4 hits on the boss, which is significant. And then it's also nice in that, as we said, it kind of provides value throughout the whole run. And same with like Imp Sickle. Imp Sickle is just an incredible artifact in general. I would almost always take it. I would never skip it, let's put it that way. But early game, just getting free imps every turn, you could low roll, of course, but even if you low roll, it's still a chump blocker. It's still going to do something, most likely. And then in a lot of cases, it's getting you Welder Helpers and Fledgling Imps, which are going to be amazing early game. The Fledgling Imp will get you that scaling that Hornbreaker so desperately wants, along with adding chump blocking, and then Welder Helper can just give you that defensive scaling that it also wants. And Thornfruit, another one that will provide help throughout the whole run. And the great thing about it is early on, 10 damage every single turn for free is actually pretty good in the early game. It's pretty relevant. So that's just going to help you out in general. Plus, it's basically a free draw upgrade. We talked about containment. Token of the Traitor is actually really good early game. I would, since you're Stygian, it's going to hit on both your torches and whatever your Stygian spell is, plus whatever other possible spells you started with. And that's a lot of damage just sort of randomly happening around the board. It's going to help with clergymen. It's going to help with backliners. It's obviously going to be countered by the armor trial, as almost everything early game is. So it's just a really annoying trial. But every other trial, it will probably allow you to take it, honestly. Like, with that much kind of guaranteed damage just alone with the torches and spears or Forgotten Power is going to be a lot of damage. Then also just a free, I forget the name of this, but the free morsel every turn. It's going to provide scaling. It's going to provide chump blocking, but mainly the scaling is going to be nice for Hornbreaker Prince. It's just free scaling, which Hornbreaker Prince makes use of. Also, if if you follow my channel, I do not love this artifact, Commemorator of Spike. I've often said it's just a pip downgrade for a 5/5 or 6. I guess it's 6/6 now, whatever it is now. But given that we know how bad the early game of Brawler can be, or any version of Prince really, this increase to damage and health just flatly guaranteed is more than welcome. Plus, you might, if you're not super unlucky, you can probably get it on at least a steward as well as the Hornbreaker Prince. One floor can get the steward, and the other floor can be the Prince. So it's a lot of stats that early game are pretty relevant. By late game, I think they're pretty irrelevant, and you don't love the pip downgrade aspect of it, but I'd still take it early game. And then the candle, I'd say is much better with the dregs. Probably one of the only times I'll ever say anything's better with dregs, but comparing dregs to primitive mold, I'd still take it with primitive mold, probably. But the thing with primitive mold is you're not going to have necessarily a bad time with Brawler with primitive mold. With primitive mold, you can just sacrifice Brawler down bottom, and he reforms quite nicely, because that's a 5/5 each time he reforms, and you're just not hurting with primitive mold. But specifically with dregs, this adds a lot of value, I think, and can get you through those early rounds. Serrated mandibles, also just, every time you play an infused card, which early game, since most of your deck is just the basics, is going to be a lot of your cards. And that's just free reap here and there, which is often going to help, just in a general sense, similar like Token of Trader. And then there's Infused Mallet. I almost didn't list this one, but I figured it's probably worth it. I think it's a trash artifact, but that's just my opinion, man. And I don't know, it's very unreliable, but it can help. Let's put it that way. It might not help, but it could help. And it's probably worth taking if you're going to be weak early game, which you probably are. And just some final notes here. If you can, try to get a full HP steward in front of Prince for those boss rounds. For instance, like if you have one that got damaged a bit and is just sitting there taking up pip space, it's probably worth, like, in that, there's the 1 round break in between the boss. Try to torch your own dude or Hornbreak it, whatever you have available, and kill it so that you can put a fresh one with full health. In most cases, unless you're like 15 sharded up or whatever, that steward should be able to take it 2 hits from the boss. And that's enough to add, 2 extra rounds of attack, which is not nothing. And you're probably going to need it. And then, Spike's Trails, nope. Although Clergymen probably is fine. If it's Clergymen, you can set up top. Between torches and whatever else you have, you can probably snipe all those Clergymen before they get to you. So you can probably take it with Clergymen. And then Ring 2, you really, so the Ring 1 rewards, remember, it's usually going to be commons, but it could be uncommons and whatnot, but really look for rage and damage scaling. That is the reason you're going Brawler, is to find those, right? If you started with them, you might not have to hunt that hard for them. Like if I started with Rituals or Fledgling Imps, maybe I don't need additional ones, right? Like if I have 2 Rituals, I'm not going to take a 3rd Ritual. However, if I do have 2 Rituals, I might take a Fledgling Imp, because Fledgling Imp, I think, is preferable to Rituals, just because it's a little easier to play them out, and a little easier to make them broken. But all that being said, especially if you don't have any of those, pick whichever one comes around. I'd probably prioritize Fledgling Imp unless it's clear that I'm doing an overstacking build. If I started with like Hidden Passages, maybe Fledgling Imp, I would say Fledgling Imp is much less desirable than Ritual of Battle. Ritual is much more desirable in that scenario, because obviously you can't really play the Imp. The reason you're taking Fledgling Imp is to hunt for Endless, or Reform if Melting is available, but mainly just putting Endless on it and playing it every turn. That's why you're getting Fledgling Imp. You're not getting it for just a one-time boost. Whereas Ritual's a little easier to make work. You don't have to hunt for a specific upgrade to make it work. Literally just getting it down to a 1 cost with 2 Ember upgrades is the bread and butter there. Or you can luck out and get the -2 Ember upgrade at the Divine Temples. But, that being said, with Ritual, and by the way, those are the prime targets, but anything will work here. Like Razor Sharp Edge is fine, Echo Infusion is fine. Flat damage, you prefer rage, but flat damage will work too. You need something, basically. But if you already have it, like we said, like you already have Rituals, you're probably good there. If you already have Fledgling Imps, might be worth prioritizing something like a Vent, because you still want those good removal spells, right? You're playing Hellhorned to get that full package. That's the great thing about Hellhorned. They're, in my opinion, the only clan in the game that has the entire package of everything that you could ever want. If there was if you did the monochrome, or the mono, whatever you call it, the mono clan mod, like I'd have to imagine I would prefer the Hellhorned clan. Maybe Melting Remnant, but I prefer the Hellhorned clan. But all that being said, if you have the scaling, look for things like Vent. Hornbreak is also acceptable, but Vent probably gets priority because it's just so good against those annoying like clergyman waves that are very common, rings 1 through 3, or even just like double backliner crossbow dudes. You can take both of them out. But if you don't get a Vent, Hornbreak I'd still take if you don't have good removal, because Hornbreak is really good at removing stuff, especially if you're facing Daedalus. Hornbreak will take those buffed up grenades out, unless you took a lot of shards. If you took a lot of shards, you're probably going to want to at some point upgrade that Hornbreak, because 10 damage sometimes can't even kill the grenades. Oh, getting ahead of ourselves. And then this is a big important part. I say go to the, so if you're not aware, Ring 2, there's always going to be a Merchant of Steel side, and there's always going to be a Merchant of Magic side. And the Merchant of Steel side will always have a banner unit. The Merchant of Magic side might have a banner unit, or it might have gold. But I always say, especially with a champ like Brawler, you should go the Merchant of Steel side. Unless you already have some insane defensive scaling, like a Welder Helper, or maybe a Branding Right, or Echo Infusion, something like that. But basically, you want to be looking for a tank, because as we've said, Brawler serves that backline purpose just fine. Even though I'll often replace him with a better backliner, I'm not looking at Ring 2 for a backliner, because I already have a backliner. What I want is a tank. Remember, there's 3 bosses in the ring that are available Ring 2. Big Sword Dude, Sweeper Dude, and Spikes Dude. I don't know the real names, but that's what we'll refer to them as. And, Murphy's Law suggests you're always going to run into Sweeper Dude. Always plan for running into Sweeper Dude. And Sweeper Dude, you're going to need something with beef. You need HP. Otherwise, doesn't matter how good your backliners are, how much damage they're doing. If they're not going to survive 1 hit or 2 hits, they're not going to kill this boss. And that boss is going to have a nice, merry time with your pyre. So you're looking for a tank. You don't always get offered a tank, so this is why you go the Merchant of Steel side. So if you don't get a tank, you need to try to get that 25 HP upgrade. If you don't get it, you're likely to find it between a reroll, right? Like if you don't find it at first reroll, try to find it. If it's unavailable, if you had really bad luck, you should have other options, hopefully. I've rarely had it not be the case, because remember, there's still Battlestone, which gives you 10 HP. There's clan-specific ones, such as 10 HP and Spikes, Damage Shield 3, Armor Incant 2, and then there's also Large Stone. If you don't hit on the 25 HP, you should slap this on the unit. And now I'm specifically talking about if you didn't find a tank. If let's say you're only, this is unfortunately a common scenario. Let's say you're only offered Branded Warrior and Hellhorned Warrior. 2 5 HP units. Well, you gotta take them, because Hornbreaker's not gonna do it alone at 16 HP. Maybe it would, but often it's not. And you need to just slap some beef on it, or else, like I said, you're not gonna beat Sweeper Boss, and you're probably not gonna beat Spikes Boss either. And that's not gonna be a good situation. You're looking at an early exit, probably. And then, as I said, tank ideally. Rail Beater is a great one here. Alpha Fiend works. Often I'm taking Alpha Fiend to get through Ring 2, 3, and then since it is such a good infusion, it can be just infused into something better later. Steelworker's an option as well. It's not going to add you any damage, but this one's particularly good if you have the damage scaling already, which hopefully you've found by now. It'll just provide you that defensive scaling, and similar to Alpha Fiend, it can be infused into basically, well, not similarly, Steelworker can be infused into anything. Alpha Fiend can't, but it can be infused into a lot of things, we'll say. And then, other clan-specific things, like Keeper of Echoes is great. Just any unit that can serve as a tank. And I think I've already explained this 25 HP, blah, blah, blah. And then, another great reason for Merchant of Steel side is if you have an imp, particularly a fledgling imp, but Lord of Helper would do too. You can slap Endless on that sucker. Also, if it's like Melting Remnant, your tombs, there's options. But, you know, Hellhorned generally I find really likes the Endless upgrade on something. Usually you have an imp, if not an imp, whatever the other clans might have available, and it just makes it so that Merchant of Steel almost always has a good upgrade to put on something, right? Like your banner would love to see multi-strike, it would love to see quick in a lot of cases, especially if it's a sweeper or a multi-striker. It would love to get health, and Large Stone is usable too, especially if you're just looking to get something to get you through Ring 2. So basically everything in the Merchant of Steel upgrade is going to have something to hit on in most cases. And that's Brawler Ring 2. I would say this applies to almost all of the Hornbreaker Prince paths, though. It's not necessarily always specific just to Brawler. And then we got the Wrathful Path, which, as I said, in a general sense has the strongest early game of the three paths. It is the only one that, let's say you didn't hit on offensive scaling or defensive scaling, one of the two, maybe both. It provides both, as long as you can get a Slay, of course. The Slay is how you get the defensive scaling, but even if you don't get the Slay, you're at the very least always going to get some offensive scaling. On top of having, you know, a little bit of beef. You know, it's of the Hellhorned paths, it's the only one that has any beef, and has potential to get quite biffy if it actually gets Slays. It's also flexible. It can be a backliner or a frontliner. And you can also, as I said, pick up a point of Brawler, or two if you want. And it can, you know, still flex as a front or backliner. It's only going to work as a frontliner, by the way, if it's getting Slays. So if it's not getting Slays, you can make it a backliner. It's also nice in that with spikes, with sweeping, even if you're scaling something else, it still does something on that floor. So like overstacked floors, it can do a little bit there. So that's where I'm talking about the passive scaling. Like, it can just sort of get scaling. And if it gets Slays, also it gets armor. Even if it's a backliner, if you have your real backliner behind it, it's then gaining, you know, armor to have more hits for Relentless that will preserve your backliner. Hopefully that made sense. And then, but that's, you know, that's really the good. It's the most, it can do the most with the independence of starting cards, you know, independently of starting cards. But the bad is, past the first few rings, in the DLC world, I just don't think it really contributes much. It's often just a throwaway unit by that point in the game, I would say. Which is not a bad thing, though. Like, often Hellhorned has enough to just do it with the banners, right? And has no need of the champ, really. So in that sense, Wrathful can be fine. Just get you through the first two rings, and then let the banner units carry the load from there. But, you know, it is worth noting, like, before, you know, pre-DLC, I'm just going to reminisce here a bit, but Wrathful 2, Brawler 1, or even Wrathful 1, Brawler 2, was so powerful. Like, it was like this amazing, usually frontliner hybrid unit that could just gain so much armor, gain so much damage, and just almost even, you know, if you get a one-horn tome on it, maybe once or twice, it could basically solo the game. And especially with spikes, it could do it. But now, it's just so much harder to pull everything there off. You know, you're never going to get enough spikes to take out dudes in the back line with 30 to 40 health come endgame, unless you have some insane spike build, of which I've never personally pulled it off. I could if I really wanted to force it, but it wouldn't be consistent, right? And even then, even if you're slaying, like, you know, using the Divinity fight as an example, even if I am slaying, say, 2 units a turn, 2 to 3 units a turn, to do 2 to 3 a turn, I would probably have had to do Brawler 1 or 2, so I'm not getting 25 armor a turn. Getting 10 or 15, that's not actually that much armor, if you think about it. You would need some other supplemental defensive spells to really make him work as a frontliner. So, Yeah, as I said, I guess I outlined that in the final point here. You can't just rely on slays for defensive scaling. You need plenty of additional things to make that work. So, I don't know. I don't love it, let's put it that way. And then Wrathful Ring 1, it's worth a lot. Torch is almost more useful to torch yourself in a lot of situations, because that's going to give you 2 rage, that's 4 damage. And especially if you don't have any scaling, that or at least offensive scaling, this is often the way you're going to have to scale up your damage. Depending on your secondary clan, you might be able to heal back that damage if it's like Awoken or Umbra. Hopefully you do. If not, you're just going to have to gauge it based on what the situation is. It's hard to really give a one-size-fits-all here, but it is, for the record, I find, especially in Ring 1, almost always better to torch yourself than to torch the enemies, unless you really have to kill a backliner. Which sometimes you do. And usually you're going to want to frontline with it, even, but sometimes, depending on the situation, if it's like clergymen, if it's some sharded up backliners or whatnot, well, hopefully not sharded up, but even just a, crossbow dude in the back. Sometimes to prepare for the boss, you're gonna have to kind of have some finesse with how you chump block. You don't want to, obviously, as we said, leave damaged stewards in front. If you're gonna put them down, hopefully they're dying in non-awkward ways. Able to prevent damage on Hornbreaker, prevent those big 5 damage hits, but also not just have it taking up pip space when you could put a fresh one on later. And I'd also definitely avoid armor trials. They're going to be pretty brutal for this. But the other trials, unlike the other paths of Hornbreaker, I think the other paths generally can be fine. He can deal with those somewhat okay. And yeah, this is, as I read this last point out, I guess it's not really that helpful, is it? But basically, maybe I can overlay a video here or something to illustrate that last point. No guarantees, though. If I don't overlay it, don't sue me. Anyway, on to Wrathful Ring 2. So here, it's, by the way, almost everything from Brawler Ring 2 essentially applies here, but some of the differences are, both defensive and off-scaling are pretty welcome with Wrathful, since you're still potentially going to frontline with him for the Ring 2 fight. So things like Welder Helper, whereas before I would say Fledgling Imp significantly is more desirable than Welder Helper for Brawler. Welder Helper might in some cases be more desirable than Fledgling Imp for the Wrathful Path. It really depends on what you need at the moment. Like, if you're really light on damage, you should still probably take the Fledgling Imp, but if you have some scaling already, Welder Helper is going to be much more useful to you, especially if you have no other defensive scaling. That'll give him that extra buffer that he can safely just sort of sit there, scale with whatever scaling you have on top of just the passive scaling that he'll get, and he'll do some work Ring 2. And in a similar sense, I still recommend the Merchant of Steel Ring 2. I think in general it's just going to be more useful, but if you foresee that Wrathful can be your tank, you can get by here getting a backliner if the backliner option looks better than the tank option. So example, like, say it's like Awoken, you see an Animus of Will or like a Husk Hermit compared with a Awoken Hollow or Awoken Thorned Hollow, either of them. I would definitely probably just take... Well, it depends, right? Like I said, if Wrathful can frontline, then I would take like Animus of Will, for example. But, big but, and I will not lie, make sure, because it's most likely, as I said, gonna be Sweeper Boss. If you don't prepare for it, I guarantee you it will be Sweeper Boss. I'd still try to put health on Animus if you're gonna take Animus. Otherwise, it's not gonna do anything against the boss. Same goes for either Branded Warrior or Hellhorn Warrior. You know, they have 5 health. Slap some health on them, but you can take them over the tank pretty safely, I would say. But either one's going to work. You're never going to go wrong taking a tank. Like I said, you can always backline with Wrathful too. He's flexible. And yeah, on that last point, when in doubt, adding something tanky is never wrong. Never wrong, Ring 2. Prioritize tankiness. And then the Reaper Path. I guess the good is that it can passively scale if you're getting slays, but I mean, if you look at these stats, it's 25 damage that it starts with and only 6 health. That's so hard to get to work. Especially, you know, Ring 1, you're only starting with Stewards most likely and whatever else you have. Very hard to kill any of the Ring 1 tanks. You know, some of them have 40-ish or more health, especially depending on if you did decide to shard or not. But it's not going to get slays in those scenarios unless you started with like a ritual or something. And if you started with a ritual, why didn't you just go brawler, right? But anyway, yeah, it just often does absolutely nothing for you. It has so little health. It doesn't have that much damage. The slay really isn't that much if you think about it, what the investment requires to get those slays. So, you know, it's so squishy that, and often you know, even though the final rank does get, I guess, double the health, like you're rarely going to go 3 into Reaper, I would feel. I mean, it's just a single striker who cares about that? Like, you would probably going Brawler Flex, and at that point, you know, you're still only getting 10 to 20, you're not having much health. It's just so hard to get this thing to work, and as I said here, just it requires a lot of investment for relatively little payoff. I mean, you're generally just going to have a way easier time getting some basic upgrades and infusions on your run-of-the-mill backliner banner unit, and it will be better than Reaper. So why have Reaper, right? I just don't think it's very good at all. But that is just like my opinion, man. So I'm sure there's somebody out there that swears by Reaper. They can make a Reaper guide if they want. It won't be me making it, because I don't like it. And I'm not going to do a Ring 1 or 2 for it, because, as I said, I just don't recommend it, ever taking it. And Hornbreaker Prince Mid-Game, this is like kind of the Rings 3 to 6-ish area. As I said, most of the time with Hellhorned Prince, the upgraded and infused banner units just outshine the mid-game Hornbreaker Prince. You know, it's in the Brawler case, which is probably the best case, it's just a poor Animus of Will, right? It's an unupgraded Animus of Will. Which is okay. It's not a horrible thing. Like, it will serve as a backliner. It's just, there's probably better options. So a lot of times, even if my plan is to go Brawler 3 by the end and have that be the carry, oftentimes I kind of just take a banner unit to get me through the mid-game and have it be the banner unit, have it be the backliner, and kind of just throw away Prince for the mid-game. I'm often doing that with Prince. Not always, but often. So, yeah, I mean, I've kind of already gone over this previously as well. You can probably just go back and you can read it, but I've already said this about 3 times in this guide. Hopefully it's sticking by now, kind of my thoughts on that. But anyway, and also, you know, if you started Wrathful and you see Brawler, you should probably snag a point of it, because you're rarely going to want to just go full Wrathful, in my opinion. Sometimes you do, if you're like super dedicated to it being a frontliner, and you really, I guess, just need that 25 armor out of the sleigh. You could go full Wrathful, but in general, I would imagine at least 1 point of Brawler would want to be picked up, so you're inclined to snag it if you see it, let's put it that way. And then I already even kind of outlined this as well, but it's often just you want to ditch the Hornbreaker Prince at this point a lot of the times, especially I would say if you went Wrathful. It's often hard to make justification for it being on a floor. There's obviously situations that come up, though, where you can still make it work, but I don't know. If you can get in the habit of just ditching Hornbreaker Prince, I think you'll actually be better off for it. That's just kind of the state of this champ, I feel. And again, even if it's Brawler 3 you're going for, not a bad idea if you have a better banner, just to kind of have it on standby for the end game. And unfortunately, unlike something like a Shardtail Queen, which we'll get to soon enough, it doesn't provide passive value that much, unfortunately, which is why it's, in my opinion, significantly worse than Shardtail Queen. And then by endgame, Brawler 3 is your most likely variant to actually provide you value come late game. And it's finally the point where this champ can actually outshine banner units, since it has that 5x strike. So now you kind of get to play with your new toy here. But even then, oddly enough, even with a 5x strike, sometimes other units are just better. I mean, your run-of-the-mill sweeper, the good sweepers like Husk Hermit, they're often just better anyway. They take out the whole floor. Even if they don't even have multi-strike, they're often better. They have more health usually. They have infusions that are just better than being a 5x striker. So again, even at this point, don't be afraid to just ditch the Prince. You don't have to commit to Prince if you have something better. And also, on that note, Brawler 3 has a real bad time with spikes, because that'll be 5x however much spikes you're dealing with. Unless you can somehow clear them out before then. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. So, that spikes trial on Ring 7, and just this plethora of spikes in Divinity fight, Brawler 3 without some sort of defensive scaling is gonna die. 100%. And again, at this point especially, you need to be stacking that rage hardcore. It's the only way you're going to make use of Brawler if that's your game plan. If you want Brawler to be your carry and you're not stacking rage, or, I say rage, which is the most likely candidate, but whatever offensive scaling you have, that should be your focus at this point. Like, if you haven't hit on Endless for fledgling imps, you need to do whatever you can to try to make that happen. If you have rituals, you need to get those, if they're not already cost reduced, you need to reduce that cost, you need to hell vent them, you need to double stack them in some cases. Dark Deal probably likes double stack more. Yeah, Rage is your friend here, and you really have to focus on getting that working. And then just listed out just some examples of what I say I look for with damage scaling with Hornbreaker. So the prime, rings 1 through 2, when you get those common off rings, most common ones you're going to be hunting for is Ritual and Fledgling. And both are going to be great. Which one you pick decides on what you think your game plan's going to be. So Fledgling Imp is the safest bet if you're not going to do a hidden passage overstack thing. Now the problem with Fledgling Imp is, unless melting is involved, you have to get Endless. 'Cause melting can hit reform, which is, almost as good as Endless. Some cases better, but you do have to hit Endless to really make Fledgling Imp shine. If you don't find it, then you're going to have a bad time. So if you think about runs where you've hunted for Frenzy Stone, right? I know Frenzy Stone series, because often you hit every Merchant of Steel that you can and you don't find it. Easily can still happen with Endless. So it's something you got to keep in mind with Fledgling Imp. If you haven't found Endless yet in your journey, keep yourself open to other options, because it's not going to be reliable if it's not Endless or reforming. There's also some infusions you can... I also like to hold off on infusing the unit if I can, if I haven't found Endless yet. It also leaves yourself open to, sometimes, you could take a Transcendent, and as sad as it is, you could use it to make your Imp Endless. I mean, you're better off making it Endless than just having both played once. Or, a Vetivery is a much better one example, you could use that to make it endless. Or put Imp into the Vetivery is probably better since it costs 0. Yeah, unless you want like Imp synergy cards to work. But yeah, Ritual Battle is always a safe bet. Generally, though, if you're going to take it, at some point you want to get that cost reduced. Dark Deal is obviously very good too. You're just not typically seeing it until the mid to end game. But usually I'll pick one up. And Last Stand also is, obviously reliant on having the rage already. But it will give you a huge spike to that damage that will solidify most games, especially if your rage dudes, have some way to prevent the damage from coming in. Then at the decent tier, I have more of the sort of tertiary rage cards and just more flat damage related cards. Echo Transfer is a very good card. If you think about it, it almost gives you as much damage as Ritual does. Over the long term, it probably gives you as much, assuming no Deranged Brute and no Rage Artifacts, because it's flat and doesn't decay. But it does require echoes. It's much better if it itself is infused, because then it's just essentially extract 1. Razor Sharp Edge is a pretty good one. The only thing that sucks is since you have that low health total on, particularly if you're going all in on Brawler, Wrathful has a less hard time with Razor Sharp Edge. But without a way to get the health up, you can only play it so many times. But it's still pretty good. I mean, it's a pretty good amount of damage on a multi-striker to put Razor Sharp Edge on it. Wicklash also, same amount of damage as Razor Sharp Edge. The only thing is it's going to add burnout, so unless you have Reform, often what you're going to want to do is hold this over, or alternatively just have a lot of burnout extension to support it. And even just like spell chain on it is okay. Yeah, basically you just don't want your unit to burn out, right? But that flat 10 is going to be pretty nice for that value level. Then Perils on Holdover is just fine. I mean, it's only Rage 3, which isn't necessarily super great. You'll notice I have Rage Serum here, same amount of Rage in the Desperate, but we'll get to that later. The Rage 3 is gonna help. It's gonna be a bit slow in some cases if it's your only form of damage, but there's kind of an assumption with Perils that you're putting it on Holdover. And in that case, you're getting that Rage every turn for free, essentially. And not only is it for free, it's providing you Ember to allow yourself to do some potentially busted Ember Drain type stuff. And in that similar events, I kind of nested Void Binding here. That it gives you pretty good amount of Rage, and you can damage shield. That damage shield's gonna be helpful. It's gonna help with spikes, sweepers, everything there. Also, just against things like Arcus, it can pretty much guarantee you'll be surviving that Relentless round if you played it enough. Void Binding loves to be double stacked as well. Then if you're desperate, I have these listed. They'll work, they just won't work well. Sometimes with the right supporting pieces, they can be okay. Like Spike is pretty bad return. Inflame and Spike are about, there's the same level of Ember per Rage at a base level. Obviously, you can get Ember upgrades to fix that a little bit, but and then the armor's about the same as well. Inflame's a little bit better on the armor front, but it's pretty negligible, I would say. Inflame is okay, in my opinion, if you can get the -2 Ember upgrade at the Divine Merchant, and then either double stack it or spell chain it. In that case, for 1 Ember, you're getting 8 Rage and 10 Armor, which still isn't, for the amount of investment that you put into it, it's not great, but we're in the desperate category here. You're only adding this if you didn't hit on all of these, and at that point, it will work. It will work. I mean, that is 16 damage and 10 armor. Look to Hellvent it if you continue to not find better options throughout the run, and if you Hellvent that a few times, it's going to add your shards up, of course, but it will do. It'll get you through. Spike of the Hellhorned can work too. You're probably really going to want to try to make some sort of either snag an artifact that can help, like the X-Cost artifact, or just something that helps with Ember, like a Tomb 5 Ember on Death artifact, for example, or
the horn that preserves Ember. Anything that can really make use of like spiking a ton of Ember into this thing is going to make it better. Also, any sort of consume removal or consume return, like Wormkin shenanigans, are going to be okay with this. Similar story with Rage Serum. Like, it's pretty. I mean, it's for 0. It's okay, I guess, value-wise, but often it's just too slow, and it consumes too. So it's not like a one-time. It still costs you a draw, right? Like, is it really worth the draw at that point? I don't think so. But if you have no other damage scaling, maybe it can work. If you have, like, Repeater Echo Right, you can get it back every turn. At that point, maybe you double stack it or spell chain it. Then you can get 6 rage out of it. And you get that every turn. 6 rage every turn will work. And Steel Enhancer, it's not rage, it's the flat damage category, but it could work. The health is welcome too on your weak brawler. It also means if you have Razor Sharp Edge along with it, you could give it additional health here and there to allow more Razor Sharp Edges. Steel Enhancer, similar to the, at least in Flame and Rage Serum as well, does benefit from Spell Chain. Like for 1 Ember and 1 card, or 1 drawn card, I should say, you get 6 damage and 6 health from it. It's not too bad of a deal. But again, these are kind of these are desperation picks. They work, but prioritize these, and if you have these, you probably don't need these. Now we get on to one of my favorite champs in the game, Shardtail Queen. Hugely, hugely better than Hellhorned Prince in a general sense, in my opinion. And I do apologize. I'm probably going to have to cut out the. There's going to be some continuity issues here because I can see my shitty hard drive's about to fill up here, so I'm going to have to stop the recording at some point in the next few minutes. But that is okay. Anyway, Shardtail Queen. All of the paths are great. Pre-DLC, I used them all quite often. I would say for me personally, post-DLC, I don't use royalty too much. But that's not to say that it's not bad. Like, I see some other players using royalty quite a lot, and they do pretty well with it. So, royalty is not bad at all. Just my personal playstyle, I prefer strongly the other 2 paths. My ideal path is Imp Parade 2, Imperialist 1. Usually I would start with Imperialist. If I see Imperialist at the start, I'll almost always take it. Because I think it just enables so much more. It's much easier to make any variant of an Endless Imp work better with Imperialist. It also, I think, has the strongest early game of all 3 paths. And it's just the most likely to provide free value, I think. And also, Imp Parade. So what I usually do is I start Imperialist, and then whenever I see Imp Parade, if I see Imp Parade, I snag it. And then if I don't, though, it's a toss-up on if I want to splice in royalty or not. It just depends on if I really think I need that extra damage scaling. If not, I'm totally fine going all 3 Imperialist. It's not like that good of an all 3 route, but in a lot of cases I just find what I want out of Shardtail in a run. The 3 Imperialist would be better than, say, like Imperialist 2, Royalty 1 or something like that. Because generally, in a general sense, this is why I like Shardtail Queen. I'm often not using her as a carry. I'm just using her to provide free value. Free value of usually just clearing out waves. That's what Imperialist does so well, but then also Imp Parades does so well. It just makes those imps free so that I don't have to pay any Ember to make that happen, and in a lot of cases I don't even have to pay a draw because I'm generating free imps each turn. So it's like just a free clear the waves type deal, and just leave some damaged tanks left over for my main floor to finish off. But anyway, I'll start with the Imperialist Path since I, of course,
generally just recommend starting that. I think it has the strongest early game. I don't know if people realize that, because they don't see any sort of scaling involved, and like the 10 and 20 doesn't seem that good, but in my opinion, it almost always allows me to take very minimal damage, if not minimal, a lot of times just no damage to my pyre in the Ring 1 fight and the Ring 2 fight. As I mentioned before, if you get a point of Imperialist, just at any point, it just locks in such easy support for endless imps. Especially if it's like something where you're stealthing your floor each turn, or you're up top and you have the artifact Light's Gift that dazes everybody. Or if you just have welder helpers coming in behind so that you can proc the Imperialist, or coming in behind so that you can get the armor to the front unit. Without Imperialist, it's often very hard to have those welder helpers then clear out the space on the floor. And so, not only is it just useful at a baseline for clearing out the space, it translates that space into 20 to 30 to 40 damage, whatever rank of Imperialist you have per imp to the entire floor, which is most of the time going to kill out any backliner, even if they have armor trials, even if they're sharded up, even if it's late game, it's going to kill them. And, on that note, you're never going to have to worry about AoE again, which is kind of a good thing. The bad, it doesn't necessarily gain huge benefit from going all three, as I said, so sometimes you start it and you just don't see Imp Parade. It's totally possible. There's only a 50-50 that you see it on the first, Ring 3 reward. And then an additional, if you miss on that, it's just an additional 50-50, assuming you took Imperialist 2. Sometimes you just lock in Rally at that point, but, it's not that out of the question to lose two 50-50s, and then in that case you just get stuck with Imperialist 3, which doesn't gain a huge benefit. It does gain, for the record, a decent chunk of health, but it doesn't necessarily, 40 damage isn't necessarily a huge amount more than 30, but it is still pretty good. And if you think about it, that's, say you have 2 to 3 imps, 80 to 120 damage versus 60 to 90 damage can be relevant in a lot of cases. It can be a relevant change. Let's see. Right, and there can be, an slight bad. It's not really that big of a deal, but just means if you do get Apex Imp, obviously you can't play it on the floor with Shardtail, but I don't think that's a huge bad, because there's, usually with Imperialist, especially with Imperialist and Imp Parade, I'm just dedicating an entire floor to Shardtail Queen. I don't really have the banners on it with her in a lot of cases, so it's not really a negative in that case that I can't put Apex Imp down. Also, there's some awkward turns against the Daze Shard of Arcus, because obviously if you put the Imp down, it not only dazes your entire floor so that they can't damage everything, but it makes it so you can't actually get your action off. So the Imp will just stay there, and you don't actually use the Imperialist proc that turn. So a lot of times you're just better off not doing anything that turn, which kind of sucks. And as far as Ring 1, remember, since you're not Imperialist, you're not Imp Parade, your imp supply is limited. Especially if you didn't start with additional imps. If Queen's imps are your only imps, make sure to just, ration it out, only use what you need. Don't over-explode the waves if you don't have to, because you're gonna want to explode as many imps as you can against that boss. This is how you get the boss kills, or if not a kill, at least mitigate enough damage to your pyre that you're taking maybe just a hit or two from the boss. So that's a big mistake. I see a lot of players that struggle with Shardtail. They just sort of say, oh, I got all these imps, I'll put them all down and just explode them all in a turn. The most obvious mistake there would be if you're already killing the entire floor, putting down an extra imp is just pointless. Even if it's to chump block, I wouldn't do it. But even in some cases, I would say, let's say you're not going to kill the floor, but you're going to kill most of it and leave like a tank there with a few health. I would say even in that case, don't put an extra imp down. Try to save it for the boss. You can finish that tank off with some stewards, and that's a better use of your imp. Like, you'd rather just hold it for that boss. You want that 20 damage to the boss. If not the 20 damage, you might want the chump block, depending on if you had like scaling to put on Shardtail or something. And then most trials, unlike Hellhorned Prince, are quite takeable. I usually would take any trial with Imperialist. The one that does give me pause, though, is the damage trial, because obviously the thing with Imperialist is you don't clear the floor before they attack, unless you have like a quick tome on Shardtail Queen, which is rare, but happens. So basically, you know, especially if it's like you took some shards, which I often do with Queen's Imp, because I think Queen has a pretty strong start. You know, these damage trials can be pretty devastating. I'd probably think twice about the damage trial. But, you know, armor trials, for example, are super takeable, which is rare to say of a lot of Ring 1 like Ring 1 champs in general. And also, similar to Hell Prince, you want a steward in front to mitigate the damage a lot of the time. Without the torches, it's harder to get a fresh one in front, but sometimes you don't want to leave it damaged if you can help it. That can be tough though, depending on the troop. Either way, you either want to have space to put 2 to 3 imps down for the boss round, or alternatively, you want a fresh steward in front, and then maybe just 1 imp to explode the floor. Those are going to be your ideal situations for doing as much damage to the boss as possible, Ring 1. And I'll tell you what, I'm about to run out of hard drive space here, so I'm going to stop the recording now and just splice it together. I mean, I'm going to have to splice some stuff together anyhow with this one. I plan on at least overlaying video on a few of these. Probably already, as you're watching it live, it's probably already happened a few times, but yeah. We'll do a quick break here and reconvene. Alright, so, back to it here. We were at Imperialist Ring 2. Remember, you have no natural scaling, so damage scaling is in high demand. But also, Welder Helper's pretty good. Welder Helper with an Imperialist, that defensive scaling is just amazing, especially if you can get that aforementioned Endless on it. And on that note, Merchant of Steel side, go it. As we've mentioned before, locking in Endless on any imp is going to be amazing for Shardtail Queen. Preferably Fledgling Imp or Welder Helper. But, a lot of times any imp will do, even like a Molting Imp is fine. You can infuse it with something later on. Even just another Molting Imp is gonna be 20 extra damage prior to the enemies hitting you, which is often nice. But I would probably prefer a tank here, but for the record, Shardtail can kind of frontline. If you like Ring 2, even if my eventual plan is to have Shardtail on her own floor, Ring 2, I'm often still putting a banner on the floor with her, if it's a 2-pip one. Not always, but sometimes. Really, you only need 1 imp to explode to really get decent value out of Imperialist come Ring 2, since you have that extra banner unit. Depending on the banner unit, it might make sense to put it on the floor. Sometimes it doesn't, though. Obviously, an Alpha Fiend being 3-pip, it doesn't make much sense to put it on the same floor, because you can't put any imps with it. You can just put that Alpha Fiend up above, have it hopefully health enhanced. Even a Large Stone is fine if you're likely planning on infusing it later, just to have it get you through Ring 2 and 3 Relentless rounds. A Large Stone Alpha Fiend can take on most bosses, as long as it didn't get hurt a bunch. And if you're Imperialist Shardtail Queen, it's probably not getting hurt much, because really the only thing hitting it would be tanks. But anyway, that kind of outlines all of those points, and since you're Imperialist, I usually give the priority on my infusions to the Imps if I find Endless early. If I'm lucky, I can find it the first 3 rings. But I probably won't make the infusion otherwise, because that's adding 25 shards, which makes the fights pretty hard for just a one-time summon. I'd only really make it if it's like an unfortunate map where I'm not going to hit another Divine Temple up in like 3 floors or something, and I just don't have a better infusion to make. Sometimes I'll do that if I think it makes sense. And also, as much as I love Hidden Passage, I find it a little less desirable in Shardtail runs. This isn't necessarily specific to the Imperialist route at all, but I thought it was worth noting that it can still be okay. I'm just rarely needing to like overstack a floor, because obviously Shardtail on an overstacked floor does nothing. At that point, it's a pretty useless unit. But sometimes I can still have her below clearing out waves, and it might make sense, depending on the type of floor I have, to still overstack. In that case, Hidden Passage is still fine. I would probably definitely look to cards like Welder Helper, Fledgling Imp, and Ritual over Hidden Passage in a general sense, as far as commons go. Even like a Hornbreaker event, I would say. But, again, if you think Hidden Passage is going to work, it can work. It's at any rate, even if you're not overstacking a floor, it's not necessarily horrible to just have it to displace enemy units. It's always useful for that too. That's pretty much going to be Ring 2. You want to get some scaling, probably get some beef, get ready for that Sweeper Boss. Also remember, the Sweeper Boss, outside of like Welder Helper, your Imps are not going to proc against Sweeper Boss. They're all going to get cleared out before you can do anything with them. So Sweeper Boss is a little bit extra annoying for the Shardtail Imperialist. In any of the Shardtail routes, really. Is going to have issues with Sweeper Boss, so you're going to have to lean on your banner unit to take out Sweeper Boss, as often you do with most clans that don't have a beefy champ. And now we're going to go over the Imp Parade Path, which, as I've said, is my desirable flex with Imperialist, though I prefer to start Imperialist, as I said, but an Imp Parade start is fine too. Sometimes you just aren't offered Imperialist at the start. Sometimes you are, but it might just make more sense to go Imp Parade. There's some situations like that where, like, maybe, I could see maybe, like, starting with 2 fledglings, maybe an Imp Parade would be better. But anyway, it's the nice thing about Imp Parade is it's so low investment. You just stick it down on a floor. Any floor will do. In a general sense, I usually put her top for the Ring 1, but then beyond that, she's usually going at one of the lower floors, mid or bottom, depending on what my opening hand is. But she's just low investment, guaranteed value. You get a free imp every turn, 2 imps if you go all 3, which is not it's not a horrible all 3 route, right? Like, if I start Imp Parade and I never find Imperialist, I'm not super sad to go 3 into the Imp Parade, but we'll get into that in a bit. But yeah, you just, you get a lot of free value. At no draw cost, it just generates a card. That card will cost 0 unless it's Transcendent. It's only 1 at that point. But at any rate, every imp you play essentially is value-wise a free Ember. You can almost think of it as an Ember upgrade on that turn, in a sense. So it's a lot of value, just free value that gets generated. And then as the all 3 points option, it's pretty good. I mean, you're going to get 5 rage every turn for free. You're going to have a bunch of armor. Generally, you're obviously just trying to chump block in the front. And the nice thing about the Divinity world, one of the only times this actually helps is there's so much incoming damage by the end game, and really at most points in the game, depending on how aggressive you were with shards. But end game is really when it would matter, since that's the only time you get that welder helper added for free. You know, by ring 7, which is when you would get that 3rd upgrade, there's so much incoming damage that usually your floors will just naturally clear out if you're putting both imps in front. And then you'll naturally get that that rage just kind of to the floor. Sometimes, if I'm going Imp Parade 3, I do probably might have another banner unit on the floor with me in that case. It really depends. And on that note, I'm typically, in almost every Queen run, I'm taking at least one pip upgrade. First upgrade is almost always the pip upgrade. And then depending on how the run shakes out, I often take a second pip upgrade as well. But second upgrade's a little more flexible. I'm almost always going pip first because reasons of this. Like Imp Parade especially just wants extra floor space to spam out your zero cost imps and get value from them. The bad is it can sometimes be a weak early game. You know, it doesn't have any real scaling. It's just Queen's Implings. And it has a little bit, you know, if I go back here, it's, you know, it has a little bit less health than Imperialist at ring 1. At all rings, really, especially by the final. But it does, however, do more damage on its own, so that's something worth note. But you just don't get that 20 damage bomb that can help with the waves, so you generally leak a bit more, and then I find, even against the boss, I do less damage to the boss typically with Imp Parade. However, it's still not, I wouldn't say it's necessarily, like if I compare it to Hellhorned Prince, it feels wrong calling it weak early game. Let's put it that way. But it's not strong. Let's put it that way. And it can sometimes run issues getting enough, like playing out the imps, if you're not going to get a point of Imperialist. Imperialist helps so much with clearing out the imps, but like I said, like even before Imp Parade 3, if you have Welder Helper, you know, typically to get the value, you would want to maybe put it behind, and if you can have it endless, play it every turn, but can't really do that if it's not just dying every turn and you don't have a good way to self-sacrifice it. And even if you do have a way to self-sacrifice it, that still costs you a draw and whatever ember it costed to do that. So generally it's just awkward to clear out imps a lot of the time, especially if Welder Helper is involved in the game plan, if you don't have Imperialist. And on that note, you know, even late games sometimes, like if I have, say, the double summon artifact, Ashes of the Fallen, that is 50 armor every turn with those Welder Helpers. Could be even more depending on the situation, and not every wave is going to clear that out, and at that point, you'll quickly run out of floor space, and at that point, you know, only the floor that you're on has the reduced embers, so now you have this choice of, like, do I play the imps out on another floor at cost? Do I have the ember to do this? And if not, they're going to sit in your hand, and when you redraw through the deck, a few turns of just imps that you can't do much with can kind of cloud up the deck, and if you have other cards you're looking to cycle through and play often, it can screw that over. So that can definitely be a bad part of Imp Parade. But Imp Parade Ring 1, I guess we already did kind of slightly go over what it's doing in Ring 1, but you basically, if you have duds, you know, you don't have any scaling, don't have any like spells that do big damage, you really could have an issue with both the waves, but especially the boss. So you're going to want to look, refer back to the Hellhorned Brawler Ring 1 early game artifact list, and probably hunt for those. Obviously take any imp artifact too, because those are going to be amazing, but you know, if you don't find those early game artifacts are going to be your friend. Chump blocking is also your friend. Big part of the value that it provides is it can preserve its health total and do some decent ring. I mean, 20 damage is decent damage. It's not great, but it's decent ring 1 damage. And if you can block, you know, probably the worst scenario is the bosses that have a crossbow behind them. That's going to be the toughest one. But if it's not that, and it's not trampling, you know, every single pip that you can get 3 imps, and that'll be 60 extra damage you get on the boss. And if you played them that turn, it would be 90 extra damage on the boss, and that will be a pretty good chunk against the boss. So that's going to be your friend, just chump blocking with those and playing them down. Leaks do often happen with the Imp Parade start, so along with early game artifacts, pyre-related artifacts can be okay, like even something that, like the banded wristband, or what is it called? Like banded, I don't even remember what it's called, but basically the one that adds 15 damage to your pyre. It can be okay. I mean, it's probably worth a take versus something else that doesn't give you immediate benefit artifact-wise, because you most likely are having stuff reach the pyre, even the boss, and that will significantly cut down on how much damage you're taking. And pyre armor would be great too, HP, etc., etc. Like Vapor Funnel's fine too. If you face the clergymen, you know, that's the clergyman group, they have 3 in front of the boss for the boss round, so I typically want to set up top. In general, I probably want to set up top ring 1 anyway, but especially against them. And that'll give you at least 1 imp every turn, impling, and that should be enough to clear those clergymen out before they get to you, which will make that boss a lot easier. The worst situation to fight that boss is when those clergymen are in front still. So it basically has his own version of the chump blocker, right? And you don't want that to happen. Turns out chump blockers add a lot of extra damage in a relentless round. And then ring 2, that's going to be similar plan to the Imperialist. You know, it probably applies to both. Prioritize good imps. I would say for Imp Parade start, the fledgling imp gets the nod over Welderhopper because you have a little bit more free chump blocking, and you might not even be inclined to put imps behind you the way that you are with Imperialist. So something like a fledgling is more welcome, especially if you can obviously find the Endless, because that's basically now you're getting 2 imps minimum a turn for free that you put in front, and then you'll have natural scaling happening at that point. I still think getting a unit with beef is always decent, right? Especially since Shardtail is even a bit less beefy than Imperialist, so it serves even less as a frontliner. Though you're probably more guaranteed to have a chump blocker, the chump blocker isn't always chump blocking, right? For instance, the dreaded sweeper boss does not care about chump blockers, doesn't care about imps either, or squishy units. And yeah, I usually at this point do let Imp Parade have her own floor and set the banners up above her. It's not always the case. Sometimes it is still more beneficial to have the banner on the floor with her. Sometimes a tank in front of her is fine. She's still doing 20 damage. If it's not the sweeper boss, it'll provide a nice barrier that she can keep hitting 20 each turn on the Relentless, which is often pretty good. But mostly I just let her have her own floor. She just kind of puts in damage for the waves and the Relentless fight, and then I focus on the main floor to scale it up and get ready for Relentless and finish off anything else that it needs to finish off. And obviously still hunt for that Endless on Imps. Fledgling on Endless will be great chump blocker that naturally scales your floor. And then we got finally the Royalty Path here, which, as I said, is not bad. I just typically don't go it. But it's worth outlining a bit, because unlike the Reaper Path, which I feel pretty strongly just sucks, this path doesn't suck. I just don't prefer it, shall we say. So the good is it passively scales at a pretty decent rate. If you look at, compare rank 1 Reaper to rank one Shardtail Queen. I already, even though 10 is pretty squishy, it's better than 6 health, and the rally is on par with the slay, which is a little ridiculous, isn't it? Like, that's so much easier to just rally. I mean, you're already guaranteed Queen's Implings and Train Sturds at a minimum, and often you might have even more than that depending on your opener, right? And, you know, you just, it's, you're gonna get good shit there. You're gonna get easy procs of rally, typically. And also, on that note, she can be turned into a carry with the right pieces. Now, I used Royalty a lot more pre-DLC, and the reason I don't use it as much post is simply because big single striking units, they could like kind of suffice pre-DLC, because there weren't these giant waves. There's only a few waves even in the whole game that had like a double gilded wing on it, for example. Whereas now, like especially in the Divinity fight, you have several fights where there's like 3 tanks in a row, sometimes 4, essentially, and a single striker without some sort of trample or multi-striker application is just not going to do it. So it's almost like, who cares if her damage gets up pretty high? It's not going to deal with the waves, so it's really just a relentless thing at that point. So the bad, I would say her early game can be weak, even though, you know, it's ironic because like her scaling, she's the only one that really scales rank 1, right? But her health is significantly lower. It's half as much as Imperialist. She doesn't really, like, it's, you know, if you think about it, it can be pretty rare to have just defensive scaling in Ring 1, so you're really just looking at imps and stewards to chump block. So, you know, Ring 1, once they die, just 2 hits from the boss will kill it. And if it's one of those bosses that has a crossbow behind it, or one of those troops, I should say, that puts a crossbow behind the boss and you can't kill that thing, then it's actually just 1. So you don't have many hits in on the boss. I should probably, in Ring 2, it's pretty bad too, a sweeper boss, right? Like, sweeper, if you got hit at all, you won't even hit her sometimes, and if you preserved all of her health, you still only get 1 hit against sweeper boss. So even if you scaled up a pretty good amount, you're still not going to kill that boss with just Shardtail Queen. Not that you're going to do that with just Shardtail Queen on any of them, but her value was all kind of, shall we say, selfish value, whereas the other ones provide value outwardly. Hers is all like siphoning that value, and if she's siphoning all that value and not really doing much with it, it can just make for hard early game. And also, unlike the other ones that just kind of are really easy to just sit there and provide free value, she has to require investments to find value. So you're going to have to figure out a way to preserve her life. You're going to have to find a way to get rallies onto her. And depending on if you got Imp Parade or not to combo with it, either one of them, it's like, Royalty, I feel, would love a situation where you could actually get all 3, but obviously you can't do that, so, or all 3 of the different paths, so either one is going to lack. So like Imp Parade will help you get easy rallies, kind of, in that they won't cost Ember and they won't cost a draw, but you're still going to have issues clearing out the AoE, and also in the case of like a welder helper, that can have issues, because often with welder helper you'd want to put that armor on the queen or a banner unit, which means putting welder helper in the back, and then without Imperialist you can't obviously clear that out. Now if you go the Imperialist route, you'll be fine in that regard, but then the imp, you don't get free imps every turn, and the imps still cost Ember to play, so it becomes investment at that point to where you really have to focus on Shardtail's floor as the floor. So the multi-floor setup is less possible, I feel, with Royalty, whereas the other ones it's pretty possible. In fact, almost just always pretty free, I would say, to make work. And I already kind of put on this last point, whereas the single striking unit really just doesn't, in my opinion, find that much use in the DLC. So Ring 1, I think you're heavily inclined to set up at top, allow yourself to find the most rallies, get the right units in front that you want depending on your setup, find any scaling if it exists, like defensive scaling especially, like maybe it gives you time to find some fortifies or something like that. Lining up Queen's Implings preemptively without making use of the summon damage. So like often you want to get that 10 damage to get the value out of the Queen's Implings. Here it's fine, I think, to really just play them up top even if there's no units in front. Just so you start getting those rallies going. You never know what you're going to draw, and you don't really have the luxury to try to be greedy and get that value. Just getting them down so that they'll die when the units come and attack you, allowing more time to play more imps, or in some scenarios steward, is going to be good because you want to get that damage up as much as you can before Relentless, and also even before the waves to a certain extent. You want to kill that tank if you can, or at least get him down to one pyre hit. And if you can get that trained steward, I play imps first. I don't really like to slap a trained steward down before the imps. I'd like to save the stewards so that after those first two waves come by and clear out the imps, then I can put the trained steward in front of the Shardtail Queen. That way I have an 8 health unit in front that can potentially block 2 boss hits, depending on my shard level, and depending on if there's a backliner that does damage. And I think I've already kind of said this, but, well, not really. Basically, the trials are much less takeable with royalty as well, I feel, which kind of makes me also not want to start royalty as much. At 10 health, you just can't really take the spikes on. Clergymen, when I say clergymen, I mean the Mark of Invasion, can be an issue. If you get a bad draw, you can't put her down anywhere. And also damage trials, they might work, but they're iffy. You probably want defensive scaling with that. But that's pretty much Royalty Ring 1. Royalty Ring 2, I think Welder Helper's a top ad. If I start Royalty, I usually would prefer to go pick up Imperialist if I can find it versus Imp Parade. That's just my personal opinion. And getting the Welder Helper locked in early will help with that. You can also hunt for Endless on it. And you can always hunt for self-sacrificing cards like a Hornbreaker or whatnot until you find Imperialist, / also set yourself up for the scenario where you don't find Imperialist. At least you have ways to clear it out so you can keep playing it. The nice thing about Welder Helper is it adds that rally while also giving the much needed health. I think it's much more needed than Fledgling Imp for her. That being said, if I'm not offered a Welder Helper, Fledgling is definitely a good pickup, but if I see both of them side by side, I think Royalty gets the Welder Helper taken any day of the week. It's just too useful. I'd also definitely target the Merchant of Steel side. You get even less exceptions here, I think, with the Royalty Path, given that you have that 10 health. And I think tank is definitely what you have to target here. Again, just less exceptions. Obviously, if you don't have the option, you get 2 5 health units offered, you're going to have to make do. Try to do a 5 health or 25 health upgrade if you can. Large Stoneworks. 10 if you have to. If you severely low roll and don't get any of these, if there's a Divine Temple, you might even think about just putting a Trained Steward into it at that point, because I just don't know how you're going to get through Sweeper Boss otherwise, because like I said, you're only going to at max get 1 hit on the Sweeper Boss, sometimes not even that. So, gotta prepare yourself for Sweeper Boss, because that's what's going to cause you to have an early exit. Happens a lot with Royalty, in my opinion, out of versus the other paths. But, that's that. Shardtail Mid-Game, I think, the nice thing about Shardtail is I just find her so useful at all points of the game. I mentioned it before, but my ideal path is Imperialist 1 and Imp Parade 2. So whatever you started, I try to facilitate that. You know, if you see the other one, lock it in first, because you don't know if you're going to see it later on. Even if it's a bit awkward, like obviously if you start Imp Parade, it's so tempting to take that upgrade that gets the Fledgling Imp, because Fledgling Imp is so much more valuable than Queen Simpling. But I wouldn't get greedy. If I see Imperialist, I would snag it, if you can at all justify it. Even if it technically isn't going to help you more than the Fledgling Imp would through the mid-game, I think you're going to be fine, and you're going to be so glad that you have that Imperialist, and then you can just get the Imp Parades too in the final upgrade after the Ring 6 battle. And by the time mid-game happens, like often I said, like Rings 2 and 3, you might be having the banner units with the Shardtail on the same floor. That's often just having to happen. By mid-game, that starts to dematerialize, I would say. Not always. A lot of times I do keep, like Rail Beater often likes to stay on the same floor, or even just, if I'm doing like Endless Fledgling Imp, maybe I keep an Animus behind everybody, or even a Hellhorned Warrior. It's not another question, but often I'm just having her on our own floor. I definitely take a pip upgrade to allow for more imps, and then up above I have my main floor of banners to finish off tanks and finish off the boss. And I pretty much already went over all that. Now that being said, her baseline is there just to provide nice free value and clear waves, which is already a good baseline, but often the game plan changes depending on how, like, artifacts and imp pickups, like, there's so many ways I can transition an Imp Parade and Imperialist Imp into actually just carrying the game on her own. Like, it happens quite often, actually. I don't want to make you have a misconception that she can't carry the game on her own, because she absolutely can. I just don't necessarily plan for it from the outset, because it doesn't materialize until, I would say, late mid-game to end-game. That ability to carry the game doesn't materialize until then, and you want to leave yourself out of using banner units to deal with tanks and bosses until then. And also just, you know, in a lot of cases, the end game is just going to have to get carried by the banner units. So you want to set that up, but leave yourself open to the ability to carry with Shardtail. So what I mean by that is, like, there's a lot of ways you do that. The most obvious, straightforward one would be Transcendent. If you find a Transcendent and you find Endless on it, it's pretty much GG at that point. If you're Shardtail, you most certainly have at least one Queen Impling in your deck still, probably. It's not that high a priority of a removal to remove Queen Simplings, and you just simply infuse that right into the Transcendent, and you hunt for Endless. If you find it, boom, Hellvent it if you can, if as much as possible, and you will just win the game at that point. Even if honestly, even if the Queen dies, but hopefully you can keep her there. So it's, you know, there was the nerf to 2 Ember. It's a lot easier to play it at 1 Ember. So hopefully you can keep it on the floor with everybody. But worst comes to worst, you could always take an Ember upgrade at some point, and then you can play 2 of them a turn still, or find artifacts that reduce the cost, so on and so forth. But it's not just Transcendent, you know, that's just the most brain dead easy way. You know, even things like Broken Memories Imp in a Box, you know, Spell Chain Broken Memories Imp in a Box, so you're just playing it every turn. Maybe even you Spell Chain the Imp in a Box, then you're getting 4 imps minimum every turn. Even just sometimes just fledgling imps with an Imperialist where I'm playing 4 imps a turn. Usually, I mean, that's, let's say it's like a full Imperialist, that's 4 times 40, it's 160 damage. That does almost clear out every tank. By endgame, it doesn't clear out all of them, but it'll get them down pretty far. There's also things like Impsicle, or just, you know, Welder Helper, and Rally Path and one Horned Tome. You know, you'll have enough armor that you don't have to worry, and you can go fragile and just add multi-strikes. There's a lot of ways to make her a carry. But yeah, if you have endless imps, Imperialist just has to be taken, in my opinion. But if you can't find Imperialist, you do want to be on the lookout for self-sacrificing cards. The most obvious ones would be the imp synergistic cards like Important Work or Impressive. Those are literally just meant to sacrifice your imp and have an effect. But if you don't find those, there's always just targeted removal type damage spells, like Hornbreak, for example. You can use that to killer out an imp, or Subsiming Blade, for example. Even like a Cannibalize works. Look out for options like that, basically. And if Melting Remnant is involved, I'd play around with fusing Tombs and Imps together. They're actually very nice pals. Like, a very common infusion for me is to take Fledgling Imp and put a Molten Encasement into it. And I can just start Hellventing that. And if I can find Endless, great. If not, I'll just have to reform them. But worst comes to worst, reform, but Endless is the ideal. I'm getting 2 Stealth a turn and 5 Rage a turn. If I Hellvent that a few times, I'm doubling that. I will never have to worry about survivability. I will never have to worry about Relentless. The only thing is maybe I still have issues clearing waves. With Imperialist, though, I doubt it. And with any other sort of, maybe another unit support that has a multi-strike, I doubt it. That's usually going to be enough to just do it on its own. And then, last but not least, the Shardtail Endgame. If you started Imperialist 2, if you start Imperialist, got locked into Imperialist 2, you might need to think about what your deck needs at that point, depending on what happened. It's not always just proper to, let's say you see Imp Parade finally at the end, it's not always the best idea to take it. Sometimes Imperialist 3 might make more sense than locking that in at that point. Like for instance, if you're not Ember Starved, like if you're having a fine time playing out the imps, maybe you have an artifact that already makes them free, or you just have a lot of Ember from like a Tomb artifact or something, or just whatever. Point of Imp Parade wouldn't help in that situation. I know I'm kind of like taking the opposite of what this point says here, but they're reversible points. They're vice versa, whatever. Maybe I'll read it out as it is. So, like, did you hit on Endless Imps? If you did do that, do you find yourself Ember Starved? So a Point of Imp Parade could help with that problem. Like, if I don't have Endless Imps, I can now at least get an Imp for free every turn. Even if I have an Endless Imp, if I am having troubles playing them out because of Emperor, then a Point of Imp Parade can help. Now, if you don't have that problems, Imperialist 3 makes more sense, though, like I said. Hopefully that makes sense. If you went Rally as you're starting, or if it's just there at any point, and you really need Queen as a carry, you really do need to find one Horned Tome, Furnace Tap, or Umberstone, which might mean, Ring 7, you beeline for a Cavern, because a Cavern could give you a chance at those, remember. There are events that give you tomes or rares from clans, right? And they're almost necessary, right? Like, you almost really need, like, Trample or Multi-Strike. Otherwise, if you don't hit any of those, there are options. Remember, there are things like Inferno, for example, that could clear out most of a floor either after it went by you or before it gets to you, depending on where you're setting up. Crushing Demise could finish things off. Forgotten Skull, I don't even know if I have the name of that right. Basically, the skull that has the Hope for Peace event and just eliminates a unit. So removal is going to be your next best friend if you can't hit on those type of multi-hit / trample scaling options. And also try to have some gold saved for that final trinket shop, because there's a lot of good artifacts that can really boost the end game of Shardtail Queen. There's the imp-specific ones particularly. Imp Sickle is always going to be good. Ashes of the Fallen's probably the top one, right? That's the one you see it, and it literally just doubles the value of most of the things you're doing in a Shardtail run. And then Queen's Tail's pretty good too. I wouldn't say it's as good as the other two, but it's certainly pretty good. You get a free draw and a free ember out of it basically every turn. Most likely every turn. And it's worth holding gold to try to find those. In a similar sense, if you see a trinket shop and you have gold, you should probably do it. Even if it's before the final one. And then closing this out here, if you have multiple fledglings infused into fledglings on Endless, or also the Transcendents, you can also just let the Queen have her own floor and carry the game entirely on her own. I've already said that before, so that's just reiterating that point. But just to reiterate it, even if you poured some resources into making banner units work, sometimes you just, as you similarly abandon champs in a lot of runs, you can abandon your banners in a lot of runs and just completely have Queen plow down Transcendents or even fledglings, and it'll be fine. Or sometimes, as I've said, an Animus of Will with the Queen is fine. If you didn't hit Transcendent, but you have fledglings that are doing 10 rage a turn since they're infused into one another, and you have them every turn, that's usually enough to carry the game. But that's going to be it. Hopefully that helps describe what I think is some of the ideal ways to navigate these champs, especially the people. I know a lot of people do struggle with Shardtail in particularly, which I'm telling you, she is potentially the best champ in the game for what I'm looking from a champ, which is consistency, a consistent floor, and just low investment. She doesn't have to be the carry to be good. My win rate with Shardtail is very high, by the way. Significantly higher than Hellhorned. I'm going to redo my data soon, so look out for that. I know last I looked, I think my Shardtail was upwards of 80% win rate at Covenant 25. And it's definitely higher now, because I have only won with her since then. I have not lost with her. So we'll see what it is now. I'm going to rerun my data soon and do an update there. But anyway, as always, thanks for watching. Until next time. If you aren't subscribed, please, I hate doing this. This is such a YouTuber thing of me to do, but if you wouldn't mind, please subscribing. I am trying my damnedest to get to that 1,000 mark. That is my goal. I want to see, if you weren't aware, that 1,000 subscriber mark is basically where YouTube allows you to even make any monetary value off anything. Like, I'm literally not allowed to get even paid for any of this until then. And my dream, maybe one day, is to, I don't know, escape the corporate world and do something like this for an actual job. But it'd be nice to just get a sense of what I can make in a month doing this. So, personal selfish reasons, but if you wouldn't mind subscribing, if you haven't, I would love that. I'd appreciate it. I do it all for free at the moment. It'd be nice to get a little bit of side cash for it at the very least. But anyway, until next time, thanks for watching. Peace.